Hello, and welcome to the Living Well Show, the program that strives to empower older adults to live life on their own terms. I am your host, Nicolette Hume, the Community Engagement Coordinator for the City of Lake Oswego Adult Community Center. Today, we will be talking about religious abuse trauma. Religion can be a source of strength, guidance, and support for many. However, it can also be used as a tool to manipulate and control the hearts and minds of those who have been either victims of clergy or scapegoats of a religious community. I would like to introduce today Connie Baker, who has dedicated her life to helping religious abuse survivors find courage, hope, and freedom on their journey to healing. She has a Master's of Arts in Counseling and is a licensed professional counselor in Portland. Connie is also a trauma recovery specialist, trained life coach, and author of the new book, Traumatized by Religious Abuse: Discover the Cultures and Systems of Religious Abuse and Reclaim Your Personal Power. Welcome to the show, Connie.
Thank you, Nicolette. This is so fun to be here again.
Yes, I will say, audience, that Connie has been on the show, I think, 3 times now, and I will say she is a personal favorite. But I would like to first begin this program with, as a counselor, you certainly see clients for a variety of different reasons. However, you are also someone who has a heart for those who have been abused from or has had trauma from religious abuse. And so could you tell us a little bit more why in particular this topic certainly interests you?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And that's always a great first question. When people want to know, how did you get into this? And part of, if you ever want to know a therapist's story, watch what they specialize in. For the most part, that's exactly how it works. And there's no difference with my story. My main specialty area is religious abuse recovery. And I got into it because I'm going to make the story short. I have a long story, a medium story, and a short story. So I'll tell the short one first, and then we'll go ahead and expand on it maybe later if Nicolette has some other questions. The short story is I was sexually abused by a pastor when I was 25 years old. I was then blamed for it by the church leadership and asked to make public confession of what they called my sin. And then I was removed from the congregation. And this church had been my life. I had given my blood, sweat, and tears for that place. I was heading to the mission field. I had a Bible school education behind me. I was ready to go. And what happened, getting entrapped in the sexual abuse and then blamed for it, was by far the most life-shattering event I've been through. And it broke me. It broke me. I was suicidal. I was dealing with panic attacks, depression, for months and years on it. Not panic attacks, not for years, but those first many months. So there was just so much happening in that recovery time, and it took me about 10 years to recover because this happened back in 1990, and back then no one was talking about religious abuse, about spiritual abuse. Those words weren't even a thing back then. And so I was wandering in the dark, trying to figure out how to rebuild my identity. My reputation had been destroyed. My life purpose, where was I going? My faith, what was I going to do with that? So it was devastating. And part of why I've gone into this arena is because I don't want anybody who's gone through this to take as long to sort it out as I had to, because there were no tools, no resources. So that's my book and my therapy are geared to to helping people like that 25-year-old who went through it.
Now, what exactly is religious abuse? How would you define that, or what are the characteristics of that?
That's a great thing to define right off the bat. First of all, to some people, there's a history here. 5-6 years ago, most people would not have a clue what I was talking about when I said I deal in religious abuse. They're like, what does that mean? Like cults? I said, well, it can mean that. But so what happens is culturally we're getting a greater and greater understanding of what is this thing called religious and spiritual abuse. That said, it still needs to be defined because most people still can't wrap their heads around it. We think of sexual assault, like my story. And in my story, what I say is 25% of the damage done to me was from the sexual abuse. 75% was being blamed for it and then kicked out of the congregation. That is what destroyed me identity-wise. And so it's not just sexual abuse, and that's what most people think of. So the definition is any abuse has intrinsic in it what I would call a power differential. It's where one person, an institution, or a group has more power than an individual. With that power, in spiritual abuse specifically, they leverage God or religious ideas to control, manipulate, weaken, silence, hurt another person. So the essence of all abuse is a person or institution using control that harms another human. The unique part of religious abuse is the idea of God or spiritual ideas, spiritual writings, are used to leverage that control and say, you've got to do what I say because God says.
So, just out of curiosity, when let's say you're dealing with a pastoral figure, no particular denomination or what have you, but a church leader, is it because that person may be a narcissist, or is it the community? Like, what gives that person so much power and authority to put that upon a person like yourself? Or is it, I don't know if my question's making any sense, but is it a person or is it a community that is more powerful with that?
Yes, it is both. It is the combination. So an abusive leader often is very charismatic, very charming, very likable. And so people listen to them because this likable, charming, powerful leader is telling me about the divine. They're telling me about the most important issues we can talk about. So on one hand, it's a leader. It is, you've got this person who people are looking to. Can they be a narcissist? You betcha. They don't have to be. They don't have to be, but that is one expression for sure of a powerful and a leader who is misusing their authority and misusing their power. The issue is you can't have an abusive leader without a consenting group or institution. So you can't be a leader if you don't have followers. And the rules and spoken and unspoken of the institution as a whole in an abusive structure support the leader. And this gets into pretty complicated sociology and psychology, but if people are saying that person, I often use a male pronoun, it can be women too, but if that person is speaking for God, then we want to rally around that and we want to support that leader. And if he ends up, the psychology often goes, if he ends up hurting people in the process, well, that's not great. But we're doing God's work, and so we've got to support the leader. And so in that way, the culture and rules and codes of the institution also support the abuse. And abuse does not happen with just one main leader. So, for instance, in a structure, in a religious structure, let's take a Protestant church. That's my background, as Protestant church. In that structure, you've got the head pastor, but underneath you often have associate pastors. You have staff members, support staff members. You have volunteer leaders. You have all these layers, and you have small group leaders in there. And so any one of those, if they have power, the small group leader can't abuse the pastor, but the small group leader can certainly manipulate and control and do damage with the power they have to their group members. So it can go a lot of different directions, always top down. But in an institution, it is not just the top leader that does the abusing. That said, that's usually the person who has the most power, so that's where it shows up. But in a healthy religious system, and that's all on a spectrum, by the way. We're going to talk about spectrum. It's not all healthy or all unhealthy. But ones that tend toward the healthier spectrum, an abusive leader isn't going to stay there long because abuse of power isn't tolerated, and it's not part of the cultural code. So that's a whole nother story of how you can get pockets temporarily, but you're not going to have a men's ministry director who is abusive when the whole institution and culture does not support the abuse of power. Eventually, he's going to get his hand slapped and have to leave if he keeps it up, if he keeps abusing power. If the head pastor is more healthy and all the other power, the board of directors, whatever it is in the church, if all of them are healthy, you're not going to support a really abusive leader for very long on a lower echelon, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But then it also is kind of concerning because if that person is, in a sense, kicked out or ostracized or what have you, then they just go somewhere else. And
completely.
To another community. And, Protestant, Catholic, other religious denominations out there have certainly seen some of that movement, to different churches or parishes or what
Absolutely.
have you. And so also I have a question. So we're talking about religious abuse. However, as society is kind of progressively moving away from organized religion, I would say as the younger generations come up, that this idea of cults, I almost wonder if many will be more at risk for being abused by cultish groups. So with that being said, what would be the difference between religious abuse and a cult? Like are they similar or are they different?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think there's two questions in there. One, maybe are we more prone, because institutionalized religion is dropping culturally in its impact. And the second is, what's the difference between religious abuse and a cult? And both of those are great questions. The first one, I think you probably have a good read on that, Nicolette, that what a religious institution provides at its very, very best is a sense of belonging, community, connection with other humans who are like-minded. You're working on things together. You have a common purpose. You meet regularly. It's hard to find that level of community anywhere else in our world. I mean, I deal with people who have left the church all the time, and they say, where do I find community? And it's like an understood with those of us who have left, and I've done some form of returning, but it's really hard to find deep, connected, living life together sort of community outside of the church. And if you've been raised with that or grown up with that, that is a remarkable loss. Now that kind of leads us to the second question. Since church isn't doing near as much of that as small towns and churches used to, we've got big cities, more isolation. then are people going to maybe go more toward cults? I could see that happening actually pretty easily, because we all crave a sense of connection. And cults and churches have a strong, we are a group, we're together, we love each other, we're going the same direction in life, we're supporting each other. Well, most of us kind of like that. That's a positive thing. Um, so that, I think there is something to people strongly identifying. I can see even this being like with political affiliation. All, I'm not saying one way or the other here, left or right, but a cultic type um, connection, and I think it can happen on either side and both sides. A connection of this is who we are, this is our identity, and to have a really powerful follower then galvanizes that. And so no matter how you look at this, that is kind of the dynamic involved. So with that, so if we might be more susceptible to cult type behavior, let me tell you the difference between cults and just religious abuse in general, or an abusive church. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of spectrum. It's a matter of degree. It's not one perfect delineation where now you're a cult. Oh, you were an abusive church, now you're a cult. And so let's say over here you have really healthy religious institution of some sort. And not perfect. We're all going to have some abuse of power at certain levels at different times. That's life. But the ability to make repair, neutralize power, or give away power to those marginalized, all of that is a sign of health. Then you go clear over here, and on this end of the spectrum, you've got cults. And that is extreme control to the point of brainwashing, to the point of complete ostracization, sometimes physical assault if you leave. I mean, there again, Scientology hit a whoo, Leah Remini gave us a bunch of information on that a few years ago with everything. And people who left it that were in leadership were like literally physically tracked down and drugged back. I mean, that's just like the extreme cult end of things. And so over here, so basically what it is, it's a degree of how much power is being held and misused by the leader, and how much power is being given away by the congregants, by the parishioners, by the cult members, whatever we want to call them. So, and how much autonomy is allowed within the structure, how much questioning, how much disagreement is allowed. So the more disagreement that's allowed within the structure, the healthier it is. The less disagreement, the more cult-like and abusive the structure becomes. So I see all of this on a continuum. There aren't healthy leaders and unhealthy leaders. Everybody, all of us, there aren't healthy humans or unhealthy humans. We're on a continuum. All of us have a mixture. All institutions have a mixture. The desire is to keep pushing it as healthy to the healthy side as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is sometimes hard to do, because a lot of groups, whether it be cultish-like groups or religious groups, they tend to be pretty quiet. And so it's hard to really, I guess, if someone had an outside perspective or able to see things, it's hard to know really if it's healthy or not until you're kind of involved in it on a more personal level. My other question too is, with all the different types of abuse that unfortunately people can experience, what makes religious abuse different?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me give some elements first of religious abuse, because I think it's important. We, like I said earlier, often we think about the Catholic priest and the sexual assault, and we think about all these Protestant ministers getting booted for, having sex with their parishioners and this sort of thing. And so we often focus on that. And I want to point out that the abuse is also psychological. That is actually the foundation. It is you is there's a giving away of personal power that happens in abuse. And there again, good healthy relationships give away power to a degree. You can't become close and intimate and vulnerable with someone and keeping all your power. And so there's a health in giving away our power. What happens in unhealthy situations is we give away too much of our power to people who have not earned it and who aren't worthy of it. And so there's psychological, there's financial abuse. So psychological abuse is playing with your head. Financial abuse is exploiting people's finances, which of course religion has a long history of being known to do. And there's also social abuse. In other words, a powerful abusive system or leader can ostracize you from your most important people, family, friends, acquaintances. You've got huge power over that social abuse. So I just want to point out a few realms other than sexual where abuse can happen. Now, you ask a great question about the uniqueness of spiritual or religious abuse. I use those words interchangeably, by the way. I think you can call them either. It just depends on what you're comfortable with. But spiritual abuse is so profound because it deals with the most existential areas of our soul, of our life. We've got life and death, life after death, meaning, purpose, what is truth. The spiritual life is all about those. So the problem is when, remember back in the definition, when God or religious ideas are leveraged, you're going toward the very core of the human and their worldview and how they view existence. And so when God is, I'm putting quotes there, God is used to manipulate, control, hurt, exploit, weaken, silence another human being, that translates in the survivor that God is doing that. The divine, what we all hope and want to be for us, to be a point of love and acceptance and compassion, all of a sudden that's twisted. And boy, I mean, that's part of my story. It rocked me to the core because I just figured God agreed with the church leadership who blamed me and booted me. And I loved those men. It was very patriarchal. This church was. I loved those men. I looked to them as father figures, and now their voice was God's voice in my soul. And so it wasn't. I will absolutely vouch for that now, but it was at the time, and that is the uniqueness of the sexual assault, bringing God into that, of financial abuse. Investors can get financially abused, but it's usually not about God. And the psychological, abusive husbands can play a bunch of horrible mind games. And even physical abuse, by the way, in the church. I didn't point that one out, but like physical assault from someone you love. So these are just all examples of God may not be brought into that. But if it's spiritual abuse, by the way, almost all those things I just said, often God is leveraged. Often God is leveraged in physical assault of a wife. God is leveraged or brought into the justification. That's what I mean by leverage. Justifying it in sexual abuse, in financial exploitation, in social abuse, where people are cutting off super important relationships in a person's life. So that is the uniqueness, is that God is leveraged, or religious ideas are leveraged. Ultimate ideas, existential ideas are leveraged, and they hit the very core of our humanity in doing that.
Oh, certainly. I can definitely see that. And even sometimes I guess, dogma of certain churches or institutions, or, that extremely black and white thinking can be the feelings of guilt and shame for, being a normal person can sometimes lead to a lot of heartache and anguish for some people, and even to the extreme of them harming themselves. That could
Yes.
ultimately
Yes.
even lead to suicide for some, because
Yes.
they don't feel
It was
accepted
close
by
to
their
me.
community. Right. And so, out of curiosity, is there a certain personality type that can be more vulnerable to this kind of abuse? Because, like, let's say, really in any type of abuse, the person who is the perpetrator, they can see individuals as prey. And so, someone with that kind of power, do they have that prey mindset, or is this just something that just kind of happens?
Yeah. 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 Oh, that's such a great question. And you know what, Nicola, as you're asking the question, I'd love to back up. Can I take a little section of explanation? Because I think it'll help us lead into your question. I call it the question of susceptibility. Who's susceptible? Part of my heart and my work in my book, my goal in my book, there were so few books out there that both defined and described what does a spiritual abuse look like. And I have a list of spiritually abusive messages that I think could be really helpful to look at, because I think it gives a description.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what triggered my thinking is you just described a couple of them. All or nothing, black and white thinking. And so I just, if I could just kind of go through this list real quick, I think it helps paint a less two-dimensional picture and makes it a little bit more. So we go, oh, that's how that power expresses itself. Can I do that?
Yes, please.
Great. Okay. So these messages, I'm just going to read them, and most of them are self-explanatory. One of the messages, if you're in a spiritually abusive system, these messages can be implicit or explicit, spoken or unspoken, confirmed, denied, subtle or overt. So just because these aren't said out loud doesn't mean they're not in the air. Okay. So don't ask questions or question me or us in any way. That's one of them. If you disagree with us or me, you will be labeled or blacklisted or punished. This one's a big one. Don't trust yourself or your instinct or your intuition. Trust me because I'm the spiritual one. And another one is follow the rules, both spoken and unspoken, or you will be punished by God or punished by us. Another one is I or we, if it's the pastor talking to me, I will communicate with you. You will not communicate with us. So it's top-down communication. If you leave this church or organization, you are wrong or in sin and will lose your salvation. So it goes to that point where you can't leave. Another one is your worth to us is based on your performance and service and contribution. So no intrinsic value. That's the exploitive part of religious abuse. Another message is you must forgive those who have hurt you and trust them again. Oh, this works great in the abuser's favor, to demand trust again. So basically, so they can re-abuse you. You have to be open and transparent with me or us, even if you don't feel safe. That demand for transparency and openness is a huge leverage. Another one is you are a woman, therefore you have no voice or you cannot exhibit leadership or strength. And that's a lot of the patriarchal structure of organized religion. Another huge one, you mentioned shame. Shame on you is a huge abusive message. Another one is if you say there's a problem, you become the problem. In other words, in an abusive system, you can't point out a problem or somebody else says, no, actually, you're the problem because you brought it up. Keep the secret. There's usually all kinds of secrets in an abusive system. And you have to think all or nothing, black or white, which is what you talked about earlier. And you can't have or show negative emotions. Those are a list that I hear story after story of different religious organizations, different people, and those repeat themselves all the time. Those messages to me are the core of what it looks like.
I will say for myself, it's given me a lot to think about in my previous or in my experience growing up, and how that's kind of affected my own views, or anything that you're brought up in is always just kind of like a part of that. I don't know, maybe you gauge yourself upon that, even though you were a child and learning a lot of these things. But I find it to be very thought provoking for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's part of why I like that list, because it paints the picture a little more clearly than just talking about it theoretically. But all of those have a power differential implied in them. All of those
Mm-hmm.
messages have someone saying it who has more power than another person. So
Right.
those are some messages I think are really central to understanding religious abuse. And by the way, those are right out of my book. For those of you listening who say, "Ooh, that gets my attention," I've got some. Okay, I like my lists. I've got some great lists of things like that. Several of my chapters are just basically checking off the boxes and explaining what do all those things mean. And I think it's just super helpful for somebody who's been through it to say, "Oh my gosh, that was implied all the time," or "that was actually said all," and to make it concrete for a religious abuse survivor, I think is really therapeutic. So that's part of why I put those very concrete ideas out there.
I think also too, what can feel kind of confusing even for myself is when some of the things that you had discussed were or are a part of a religion that, like say for myself, that I grew up in, that has been widely accepted
Mm-hmm.
by many different countries, or seen as
Sure.
an authority,
Yes.
that it can feel like, but that seems so crazy to hear, that there's just certain things that you mentioned that I'm like, makes me kind of think about things there. but
Yeah.
but moving
Yeah.
on to susceptibility, or people who are
Yes.
susceptible,
I'd love to talk
with
about
all that
that.
you defined.
Yeah. Yes. And so let's just be honest here for a minute. Most of the time when we think of abuse, we think of somebody who's kind of quiet, an abuse victim. Okay, when I say abuse victim, let's just all confess that a lot of times the immediate idea is someone who's a bit shy, who's a little weak, who's pretty broken, who doesn't have their voice, who isn't maybe not very bright. Okay, I'm just being really mean. I'm an abuse victim here. So I'm painting this picture because I want to just acknowledge that's a lot of times what our unconscious mind goes to. And that is untrue. So I want to talk about this. A lot of times when somebody is recovering, the survivor is like, "Oh my goodness, how did I get involved with this?" And a lot of times, here's what they'll say: "I was a leader. I was I was a rule follower. I was a go-getter. I I was involved in everything. People looked up to me." This is my story, as well as just almost everybody's I've heard, is I was going for it and people respected me. And so you've got this strong, I was competent. And a lot of times they're like, I knew my theology. How did this happen? And part of this is that person is absolutely those things. They are also have another subset going on at the same time, and I did. And so a lot of times they are they're in leadership, they're go-getters, they're competent and confident, but they're also underneath very compliant, very eager to please. There's a fear of anger a lot of times, a fear of abandonment. A lot of times there's a background of rigid or abusive or neglectful parents. My parents were pretty awesome. They loved me dearly, and at the same time, they were incredibly rigid and very hyper authoritarian and responsible, and there's chains of authority, and kids do what they say on the first demand and all these things. So some other susceptibility factors are a very strong black and white mental framework, a very strong authoritarian mindset, like you always obey authority. And sometimes people are lonely, they have self-esteem. There's a susceptibility, if you're in the middle of a life crisis, to get into a group that feels initially incredibly supportive and connected, and then find out it's actually very rigid and controlling. So another susceptible thing is a person who's easily made to feel guilty. So really, a part of what I'm describing here are nice people, are kind, good humans who are salt of the earth people, and some of them are good leaders and have strong opinions and are movers and shakers. But it's this combination with this black and white framework, this compliance, this eager to please, fear of other people's anger, and those sorts of things. So if that paints a picture, when I teach on this, I always have these two columns of one of them being all these strong, I'm strong, but I also have this other subset that's going on at the same time underneath it that makes me want approval and want to belong. And a lot of times, if you come out of a rough family, the desire to belong is intense, and religious institutions can substitute for that. They call it family for a reason.
Apparently, I am susceptible. With everything that you listed, I'm like, oh goodness, because when you were first talking about what we generally think of that type of person to be, you think, well, I don't identify with that, but everything you're saying, yeah, I can see how you can essentially be a prime candidate for that. So I guess I need to keep my eyes peeled, Connie.
Yes, even if you're super competent, high functioning, yes, I mean, it can still happen, because if we're saying we believe what the institution and the leader is saying, if they're speaking for God, we can't step out of line.
Right. And also, too, I wanted to ask, so talking about who may be more susceptible than others, what are the hallmark characteristics of abusive leaders and abusive religious cultures? Is there anything else you would like to share in regards to that?
Yes, I love that question. When you sent these preview questions to me, I'm like, did she read my book? Very good, Nicolette. These are great questions. So yes, so part of this is an abusive. I have a chapter on abusive messages, which I already went through. I have a chapter on abusive systems, because I think it's important to talk about what does an institution or the systemic feel. What does that feel like, and what describes it? And then what does the actual leader look like? And so I'm going to go ahead and do the systems and the leader. So, and there again, you're going to hear a little bit of overlap, a little bit of repeat. So a spiritually abusive system is characterized by a very strong emphasis on authority. I've already talked a little bit about that. They use fear, guilt, and shame as motivators. There's an emphasis in the group on being special or unique. Interestingly, there's often a substitution. Previous drug addicts and alcoholics come, and religion ends up being the substitute drug. And there again, that's going to sound very offensive to some people who are of faith, and I don't mean it that way. I actually am a person of faith, but in abusive systems, those can be substituted. So there's a demand for unquestioning loyalty. Patriarchy is a huge indicator. Members often feel off balance, confused, manipulated, and exhausted. There's often extreme ideas around sexuality, either extreme repression or extreme go for it, a combining of sexuality and spirituality. There's the use of coded language, and I explain this a little bit more in the book, but there's certain phrases and words that set you apart and make you one of the group. So another a characteristic of an abusive system is religious and ideas and language to gain compliance of members, which is the whole point. There's a lot of denial in religious systems because they're trying to protect themselves against this difficult reality. Rigid black and white categories and language, and us versus them mentality. That's a huge one. The more somebody's pulled in and say the world is against us, the more on the unhealthy stream it's probably going to be. And then engulfment. Huge amounts of service, energy, time, and money are required. So that list kind of shows a little bit of what an abusive system looks like. Characteristics of spiritually abusive leaders. I've already said this one. They have a magnetic, persuasive, and charming personality. Most of the time. Very few leaders are just unattractive and unlikable because nobody's going to follow them. So they have no effective or objective accountability. This is a huge one. They are a law unto themselves. They always need to be right. They expect automatic compliance from parishioners and staff members. They use the Bible and or religious language, whatever, to get their way. They lack empathy. They're skilled at manipulation. Some of these leaders are skilled. And if you're not a manipulator, you don't see it coming. You trust that what you see is what you get. There's usually a lot of arrogance. They do not take responsibility for flaws or relational damage. They demand unwarranted trust. This is a big one. They demand that you trust, respect, and are loyal to them and submit to their authority. They tend to exaggerate their accomplishments and abilities. They perceive themselves as special or unique with a distinctive vision. And they surround themselves with only people that agree with them and protect them. Oh man. I have a lot of clients who have been associate pastors who've been under these. The associate pastors often get the worst end of the deal because they have to protect and cushion everybody and mop up the mess of the main abusive leader. So that's a whole nother story. The last two is they take advantage of others to meet their own needs. That be financial, emotional, ego, sexual, whatever it is. They exploit others. And the last one about a leader, and this is unfortunately all too common, they use what I call the God card for power and control. And that is, God told me. And so what is a parishioner supposed to do if the parishioner says, I don't feel good about this decision being made by the church, and the leader says, God told me? You have no recourse. You have nothing to fight that with, and that is ultimate control and leveraging of God. So those are characteristics of abusive leadership, specifically in a religious context.
Wow. That is a lot, and
it is. Sorry, I did the dump truck effect there. No, sorry about that.
You didn't. It's just a lot to think about because you're like, well, that, sounds like regardless of religion, a narcissistic person. And then you're like, are we headed towards sociopath on some level? Which
some of them are.
I'm sure that has happened. But then even when you talked about, well, God told me, or messages like that, and you have just the average person, you're like, well, I don't hear from God like that. Maybe this person is special. I can see someone
Right.
thinking that, in a literal sense. But then I think
Mhm.
too, when you're talking about for the average person who has, natural goodwill, that they don't see it coming because it's just not how their brain works or functions. And it reminds me how recently I had seen some documentary on Netflix called The Keepers. It's a very heavy documentary, just FYI, if anyone wants to check it out. But it had to do with a particular priest in the city of Baltimore who was very much like everything of what you are talking about, and how that incredible manipulation, complete lack of empathy for everyone involved, and how, again, you talk about the covering up or having this inner circle who protected this person. Because that's the other thing, is when you're protecting a person, you yourself become guilty as well. And so it's almost like a chain of needing protection from all these different levels that are involved,
Mhm.
because rarely is it just that person. But I know in watching it, I was like just so incredibly heartbroken and disturbed on many levels. And my own personal thought was, I, the reason why I'm feeling this way is my brain just can't handle it. It's like
Yeah.
my brain and heart do not feel this way. And I just don't know how people are capable of that. But again,
Yes.
that's just me. Um, but I know I'm not alone in that as well, is that
You're
your brain just doesn't think that way.
It totally doesn't. If we are people who approach life with basic integrity, with a basic sense of I want to do the right thing, and don't have huge needs for power and control over other people, we're not going to get it. And this is the head trip of abuse in general, but specifically religious abuse. I'm listening to you, uh, Nicolette, say, "Oh my gosh, how could that even happen? I can't even wrap my head around it." You put yourself in the person who it has been done to, and it is crazy making to try to sort out. It's a
Mm-hmm.
really long, involved, and painful process.
I I can't even imagine, and I think that's the part that hurt me the most, is just knowing that some children, of all people of all ages, but that they can be taken advantage of so horribly, and
Yep.
by people who just literally don't care. People are nothing to them, essentially. And so, with that being said, another question I have is, what are the emotional, mental, and existential damages after abuse?
Mhm. Yeah.
What does that look
Oh,
like?
so many, so many. Um, there's a lot of realms. It affects just about, if you've gone through significant religious abuse, it affects just about every realm. It affects your body, your mind, your emotions, your social circle, um, your finances, often your physical body. I mean, it has impact across the board. And so, on the mental health end, you've got suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, panic attacks. Those are like almost gone through some of that type of abuse. So that is. Uh, I hope the connection's doing okay here. It looked weird. Are you hearing me okay?
I hear you okay, but if you can go through those different symptoms again, it just broke
Okay.
up a little
You
bit.
bet.
If you can just say
Okay,
what
great.
those were.
You bet. We're still having a little problem here. All right. Those in the mental health arena, depression, suicide ideation, anxiety, panic attacks, PTSD symptoms. Very, very consistently, which is so sad. So sad that is the fallout. So, and you've got, addiction, chemical dependency that pops up big time on the behavioral end. On emotional end, you've got confusion, anger, huge grief, sadness, just about every negative emotion you can think of. And then the fallout socially can be one of the most devastating. And you're losing family members, you're losing your best friends, you're losing your social support, you're losing your community. At the same time, you're going through one of the worst things you've ever been through. It's a horrible. Sometimes people lose their marriages, and on a really deep level, you also lose your identity a lot of times. Who am I now that I'm not a part of this group? A loss of meaning. There's huge rejection, abandonment. And then you've got the spiritual ends where you've got a loss of faith, anger at God, feeling distance from God, anger at the institution, grief over the institution, mistrust of anybody religious, a sense of betrayal by God and religious people. It is just huge, the damage that is done.
Well, as you speak about these things, it does remind me of all the components of grief, going through grief and realizing how that has affected you, the denial, and people can be in these stages for a very long time before they come out on the other side. And so as we're kind of coming to a close here, I want to ask you, how can a survivor heal and recover from this type of abuse? What can they do? And what does that look like?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. And of course, that's what I spend my time doing. There's all kinds of things. Number one, especially in this arena, education is huge. You need to educate yourself. This is what I wish I had. I wish I'd have had my book and some other really good books out there when I went through this to help me sort. You've heard these lists I've given you. I wish I could have looked at it and gone, oh, check, 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 check. And by the way, you don't have to check all those boxes for something to be very abusive. Sometimes component parts of those are not a part of the abusive system or the leader or the messages given. So, but I wish I'd have had some to say, yes, that's what they said. This is what they did. And you just put it into words for me, because you're is so tied up with everything. You're taught not to question that. And so it's so confusing. So to combat the confusion, education, I think, is a really important component part. What do I need to learn and know about this? There are online groups all over the place. I have an online group, Overcoming Religious Abuse Community, on Facebook. We have online groups that you can start conversing with people. I think validation is really important, to be able to hear other people's stories, to tell your own story and have people validate it. And when we hear another story and we see the similar parts, it helps us to sort it out and begin to heal. And that's so good for our brains to try to get that going. There's a lot of work. So books, online groups are super helpful. Therapy groups, individual therapy. There's just all kinds of stuff that can be helpful in that process, to say, the building of good boundaries. Most of the time, when you've gone through religious abuse, you have not been allowed to have personal boundaries. You've not been allowed to say no. You've not been allowed to say, I don't want that. All of that is super. Boundary building is essential. the process of forgiveness I talk about in my book. Unfortunately, forgiveness is part of what's leveraged against abuse survivors. But the
Mm-hmm.
process, even in secular literature, a letting go is, they've shown, is psychologically helpful. Well, what does that look like when the idea of forgiveness has been distorted and used against you? And so I talk about that also in my book. So there's just a lot. There's a lot of different things people can do. A lot of it is not feeling so horribly alone.
Yeah.
So, and that's where the validation and even the education help that. It's like, oh, somebody's putting that into words. That's super important.
Oh, definitely. And this particular topic, I mean, people always think of what we traditionally think of as abuse, but we never really think of it in terms as religion being a mode of that. And I know when I first heard about your book, I was like, wow, this is really heavy. Because, and I'm sure, and I do wonder if there's been some pushback um, from people, you know, seeing that who are still very much a part of their communities or what have you, because it is, when you talk about education, you know, when people start seeking out different forms of education about what they are truly taking a part of, you know, what kind of community are they a part of, it can be dangerous for some of those people, as
Yes.
you have said. Um, and some people who've shown their stories on TV, like you said, that of Leah Remini, who's been very open about that. I would probably say that's maybe more extreme, but who's to say there aren't other things that go on like that that we just aren't aware of, or people don't want to share what's going on in that regards.
There's a
Um,
huge risk of going public with your story. Absolutely. I mean, it
mhm,
took me years. I mean, this is 32 years ago, 32 and a half, whatever it is, 31 years ago, that my abuse happened. I started, the first time I was with it was in a whole different city 9 years later, and that scared me to death. And then
mm,
finally, about 14, or no, excuse me, 24 years later, I went public on YouTube with my story. And honestly, I couldn't have handled it in those first few years. I couldn't have publicly given my story. The pushback would have absolutely obliterated me. And by the time I was ready, it took a lot of internal armoring up to say, I know why I'm going public. I am going public, and let the chips fall where they may. And some of the pushback's been nasty. And, you know, it's been a long time ago, so there's less than it would have been had it been just within a few years of what happened to me. So, yeah, there's a high
mhm.
cost to go public.
And as we come to a close here, what final words of wisdom would you like our viewers to take with them?
Yes. Oh, I always love that. And it's always the same. There's hope. There's hope to get better. There's hope for healing. There's hope to regain your identity, your hope to regain your sense of self. There's hope even to regain the spiritual part of you. And that's part of why I love speaking on this, is because here I am 31 years down the line, and a lot of people have said, Connie, just by the fact that you're living and breathing and have a good life, that's hopeful. And I say, absolutely. That's exactly right. And I could have never imagined this the first few years after my abuse. I was like, my life's done. I'm done.
Mm,
And so I just want to say there's hope. There's hope for all those things to thrive eventually. And you may need to get some extra help in the process. I did. I've been through counseling on this. I'm in and out of counseling the rest of my life. I think all good therapists should be, because we got to do our own work. But yeah, you've got to do your work. But there's so much hope for your system to heal and to mend and to find others who have been through it.
absolutely. Thank you so much for being with us today, Connie. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Every
Thrilled to
time
be
it's a
here.
pleasure.
Oh, Nicolette, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
You're welcome. And as you've learned today that, you know, as Connie has, you know, told us time and time again, there is definitely hope. And although people and communities have harmed people, people and communities can heal people. And I hope for anybody who has come to the realization that they may have had this type of abuse in their past or present, to not be afraid to reach out to those who can help you, because there's definitely communities there and therapists there that can fully help you understand and digest some of these complicated parts of your past. So thank you for tuning in today and being a part of our community. I am your host, Nicolette Hume. Always be kind, be safe, and definitely stay curious. Take care.